Thanks very much, Dr. Maja. It's wonderful to be here and address you today. It's quite exciting for me. So I want to speak more about the technical progress that we've made and some of the outputs that we've got from our system. As Adrian indicated, we've done a fair amount of work since 2016. This is our public-private partnership in sort of more schematic form. The SAEHP put themselves in that space between the public, between the private veterinarians, between our laboratories in South Africa, and in that gap between those bodies and our provincial veterinary services, who, as Dr. Maja alluded to, do control on a provincial level, and then finally with DEF, with our central competent authority. And we interact in a number of spaces to do with African horse sickness control, and I'll show you that now. But really, the important relationships that we have with our provincial system are with the Western Cape province, because most of the African horse sickness control takes place in this province where we are now. So we've got a very, very strong relationship with the Western Cape government, but then also with our South African police services in the Western Cape, who also form part of our control measures, particularly when it comes to non-compliance of African horse sickness regulation. And then our interaction with DAF is sort of a three-way interaction with them. We interact very closely with the epidemiology department when it comes to disease reporting and spatial risk of African horse sickness. When it comes to their disease control section, that's primarily to do with the work that we did on our veterinary procedural notice, which I'll speak to you now about as well. And then we also work very closely with the import and export section. Import section, because of course we're very interested in the regulations that are applied to horses coming into South Africa, and how we mitigate risk for South Africa for some of the diseases that we're free from. And then also for export, of course, we want to develop new protocols, not only to develop and reinstate the protocol with the EU, but to develop new trade protocols with all our friends and many of you represent those countries that we would like to trade with all around the world. The principles of our control are based on zoning, and that zoning was implemented way back in '97, and actually it's primarily to do with the climate differences that we have in the Western Cape, where we've got a very Mediterranean climate compared to the rest of the country, which is more tropical, and then we've got this very severe band of semi-arid and arid region between those two areas, and that allows us to create this free zone in the Western Cape where the risk of African horse sickness is absolutely negligible. And the basis of that zoning is based on EU principles. With the current consolidated version is 2008-698 in the EU journal, and then Dr. Bosman, Bruckner, and Fall, way back in '97, published the basis of the regionalization of South Africa, and those principles still stand us in good stead today. The one very important legislative change that's occurred within the last couple of years is our consolidation of our provincial protocols into a central protocol. And that was one thing that our partners around the world wanted to see. They wanted to see a central government control system. And so all our provincial control measures on the movement of horses, on how horses are vaccinated, on when they're allowed to move, have all been consolidated into what DAF call a veterinary procedural notice. And the African Horse Sickness Veterinary Procedural Notice was finally published in December 2019. And so now all African horse sickness control within the country is based on a central competent authority document, which is very, very important. And also the thing about that veterinary procedural notice, we don't only use our own internal control principles. We take into consideration how Europe control African horse sickness and other diseases, and then obviously very carefully how the OIE control diseases. And for instance, we've implemented similar principles to what the OIE have implemented with HHP. So we've also got the ability to move high health, high performance horses from Gauteng, for instance, into the Cape to race. That's an example of how we've tried to implement these OIE principles into our own internal control as well. So our control in South Africa is based on four major pillars. We control movement, we control vaccination, we have a census of horses and we are aware of where they are, and that allows us to mitigate risk. And then finally we do surveillance. And these are the four pillars of control that we have for African horse sickness. The control of movement in the country is twofold. Any horse that comes from the infected part of the country, so that's the majority of the country except for the Western Cape, which is the small little area down where we are now. every horse that comes from the infected area has to move under a permit. So it has to have a permit to move, it has to have vaccinations that are compliant with our regulations and with EU regulations. It has to be positively identified by a veterinarian as well and have a registered passport. So every single horse that moves into the African horse sickness controlled area has a permit to move. And then within the controlled area, there are also requirements. It's not a permit-based system, it's a notification-based system, but still the principles of identification and vaccination still apply to all horses moving between zones of African horse sickness control. Our systems have allowed us to finally understand how horses move in the country. So the two maps on the screen are an analysis of 2017-2018 African horse sickness period, where we evaluated a year of movements into the controlled area, and then we've just published our 2019 movement report. And what we clearly see is while we control movements of the whole of South Africa into the controlled area, we've actually got a very, very limited area of where horses come from. And most horses come from 5 state-fed areas, 2 of which are in the Western Cape, 1 just outside the Western Cape in Port Elizabeth, and then an area in Gauteng, up in Johannesburg, and then in Durban. The interesting thing that we found now is because we register every horse that moves and we include breed and sex, we know that 50% of all horses moving into controlled area in South Africa are thoroughbred horses. So, of course, the thoroughbred industry's got a huge interest and fund a lot of the work that we do, but the reality is they're also one of the biggest users of our system. We control vaccination within the surveillance zone. We know that we've got some challenges with the live attenuated vaccine. They've been well published and everyone's fairly familiar with those, but it certainly doesn't prevent us from the ability to trade in a safe and sustainable manner. So every horse that gets vaccinated in the African horse sickness surveillance and free zone can only be vaccinated in our winter period where we've got low vector activity, and every single horse gets the owners request permission to vaccinate from the states, and we issue that permission or not. So to give you an idea, we issue permissions for about 7,000 horses during the vaccination season every year in the Western Cape. Finally, one of the side benefits of all the work that we're doing is because we allocate horses to holdings for all our control, be it vaccination or movement, we start to build up a picture of our horse population within the Western Cape. So the map on your left on the screen shows the Western Cape province, where we've registered all the holdings within the province and all horses that are on those holdings. So we've got in the region of about 1,300 holdings within the African horse sickness controlled area. Of those, there are just over 20 that are in the free zone, in this zone, and those are all thoroughbred racing training yards. We've got about 1,100 in our surveillance zone, and then about 250 in our protection zone. And we know that in all of those areas, we've got about 17,000 horses altogether within our controlled area, and we know where those horses are. The other benefit of the work that we've been doing is we've not only formed a partnership with our government, we've also formed a partnership with our nature conservation authorities, and they're responsible for zebra control. And zebra is one of those species that people from outside of Africa are fairly unfamiliar with, and they're seen as a threat. Every holding in the Western Cape has to be registered to have zebra on them. We know exactly how many holdings have got zebra on in the Western Cape, and we know how many zebra are on those holdings. And this partnership, we try to be as transparent as possible with the information that we find. And we've recently published in a peer-reviewed journal the potential for these zebra in the Western Cape to act as a reservoir host, and why they're not a competent population to act as a reservoir host for African horse sickness. So we do try, while our work is not research-oriented, we try to use it as much as possible and publish in research and peer-reviewed publications. And then finally, while we do most of our work in the Western Cape, of course, we have to register where horses come from into our controlled area. And so what we do is build up this, the understanding of the horse population within the whole country. Altogether, we've got registered on our system 4,700 holdings, and I think we've got about 26,000 horses registered on our control system. And then part of the job that I enjoy is African horse sickness surveillance. So we've got a very, very well-defined surveillance zone where every month we sample 150 horses and test them for African horse sickness throughout the year. It's a system that costs about 4 to 5 million rand a year. It's a big part of our job. But what it allows us to do is, instead of being able to tell you we think that we've got a negligible risk of African horse sickness, what we can now do is we can give you a quantitative idea of how likely there is to be African horse sickness in our controlled zone. And the graph that you see on your right-hand side there gives an idea of, over time, since our 2016 outbreak, this line on top here is the probability of freedom for African horse sickness given the sentinel surveillance program that we've got. So starting with 50%, which is not confident at all that we're free, towards a point now where we've reached at the end of August last year, 94.2% probability of freedom based on just the sentinel surveillance. So that's over and above all the passive surveillance work that we do. So we're really, really confident that our system is in place. To give you an idea, I had to do an analysis in 2013 for the audit for the Sentinel surveillance program. We couldn't produce any information on the results from the Sentinel program in 2013. Not a graph, not a table, not anything. I think we had 8 Sentinels at the time. So really, we've lifted our game and now have 150 Sentinels every month tested. And then we don't, as Adrian also alluded to, we try and improve the whole time. And one of the big improvements that we've made is our interaction with our provincial counterparts throughout the country. And we've worked on a system called area status declarations where, because now we've got a central permit issuing authority in the Western Cape, but we still like to interact with our state vets where horses are coming from. So where horses come from in the country, we ask them to give a scientific opinion on the status and African horse sickness status of the areas that they are in. So from our state vet colleagues, based on the epidemiology of the disease, based on how close they are to big zebra populations like in Kruger Park, based on whether they've got a lot of vector activities or whatever the case may be. So this map shows just a screenshot of the whole country. We allocate risk. So green is low risk, red at this point in time is high risk, and purple is where we got a partial risk of African horse sickness. And we only allow movements from green areas into the controlled area. So finally, in discussion, we've come a long way. It's been 3 years, 8 months since we've had an African horse sickness case in our controlled area. The EU suspension period is 2 years, so we're almost twice as long into our suspensive period as what the EU had in mind for our last case of African horse sickness. But we've gone 3 full seasons in the Western Cape without a case of African horse sickness, which we're very proud of. And our system have really allowed us to understand the epidemiology of the disease, understand how horses move, understand the risk of origin, and I think it's really put us in a good state to understand what we need to do to mitigate risk of African horse sickness in the Western Cape. And finally, I honestly can say, without a shadow of a doubt, we know more now than we knew in '97 when the protocol was developed, and by a country mile, we know more than what we knew in 2013 when we were audited by the EU. And certainly, it's our belief that we meet and exceed the requirements that the EU have for us for trade to the EU, and we're hoping that we can expand this beyond the EU once we pass our audit into the rest of the world. Thanks for your time.